In the opening moments of Brady Corbet's epic film The Brutalist, the camera follows Laszlo Toth through the dark underbelly of a transatlantic ship carrying the fleeing bodies of the European front. In the confusion and darkness, a cacophony of languages and noise, a voiceover narration from Laszlo's relatives still suffering in the Russian gulag, and the discordant clanging of Daniel Blumberg's score. It's the most transcendent moment of this 3.5-hour film, just 1 minute in, as Toth finds his way to the upper deck of the ship. Blumberg's score fuses into triumphant horns. The bright sky fills the enormous VistaVision frame, and we see her, the Statue of Liberty, upside down and grotesquely stretched by the ultra-wide-angle lens. This shot is a microcosm of The Brutalist itself, engrossing, complex, and self-consciously important. From these opening moments to the haunting final image, a mirror image of the first, Corbet's writing and direction portray the contradictory life of Laszlo Toth with the grand visual scale of a mid-century epic and the writerly ambiguity of a modernist novel. The film's enormous length, bisected by a 15-minute intermission and begun with a classic overture, denotes a patina of importance and grandeur. It's a film that rests its every creative decision at the feet of great art. Lal Crawley's cinematography reflects the new Hollywood master Vilmos Zsigmond with his complicated oneers, wide-open lenses, and ecstatic movement. The Brutalist itself is a film that begins with a VistaVision title card and an overture featuring the film's own bespoke logo. And as much as I like the film, the huge swings it takes and the confidence at which it takes them, it does all seem so very self-conscious. It does all seem so very familiar. F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby similarly presents itself in insecure and overwrought packaging, frequently foregoing subtlety for an explosive, impressionistic funhouse mirror version of life. The sentences don't just convey plot or character, but in their syntax reveal the heart of an artist who is vying for the attention of the critics. These observations may sound like negativity, but I assure you they are not. In both The Brutalist and The Great Gatsby, I revel in the ornate visions of the creators telling intimate stories on a large scale. The lives of these men are elevated to the cosmic by their presentation, and they mine the hollowness of the American dream not as Steinbeckian realists, but as operatic visionaries. What's interesting about these two works is not just their critiques of the American dream, but their contradictory natures. The Brutalist and The Great Gatsby serve as narrative rejections of the promise of the American dream, and yet their very identities and signatures are shaped by a hope for acceptance and praise from the very people they poke fun at. And while it's easy to poke at the flabby edges of these works of total earnestness, of contradictory intentions and audiences, isn't it more edifying to celebrate such big swings at the failure of our nation's greatest promise? Isn't it interesting that two works a century apart land on the same duality of intent and execution? Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald died alone in Hollywood after suffering a heart attack. Years of heavy drinking had caught up with him, and his death at just the age of 44 occurred during a stretch in Fitzgerald's life in which he found himself writing screenplays and inching deeper and deeper into a dark, depressive episode. He'd already written the masterpieces, the minor works, the forgotten gems, and he lived the life of a relic from a different time. As a young man, Fitzgerald held a delicate prettiness that bordered on the feminine, as Ernest Hemingway would gladly say, but years of bitter drinking had transformed Scott into a man missing vitality, blurred in the face, bloated at the center. He spent his days in the bungalows of studio lots, writing B pictures. By the time he died in 1940, Fitzgerald considered himself a complete failure. And what about his famous novel, so beloved and so widely read even a century after its release? In Fitzgerald's time, The Great Gatsby came and went. It didn't hit the way he'd planned, certainly not how he'd hoped for. his books, his generational talent, all but forgotten in the wake of the Great Depression and the big war that followed. It would actually be years before Gatsby found its footing as essential American literature taught in every high school in America. It would be decades before his other works found any success at all. The Great Gatsby is a contradictory work, written in some ways for the critics in the style of poetry. Fitzgerald's syntactical wizardry so overworked and labored over that it screams for acceptance in every page. It's a novel for the aristocracy and the educated, but its unsubtle damnation of the ruling class makes the novel this weird, impossible object for the people who read it in 1925. It was those people's children who loved it, the same children who endured the years of suffering the ruling class created with all of their greed. Zelda Fitzgerald, who died 8 years later, just miles from the house that inspired Gatsby's own mansion, was sent away in the prime of her life for her independent spirit and her limitless energy. An open secret lingers, hinting that she'd had a heavy hand in Fitzgerald's greatest works. Zelda, the secret genius of the Fitzgeralds, relegated to a minor note in the life of a failed artist. In a twist of fate, Fitzgerald's own lonesome anticlimax mirrors that of his most enduring creation, the figure of J. Gatsby, slowly walking to his private pool at the end of a long summer, without friends, or family, or hope for the future. In the centuries since its publication, The Great Gatsby's cautionary tale of the hollow American dream has found its way into dozens of other stories. From the intrepid social climbing of Stringer Bell and David Simon's The Wire to Adam Sandler's George Simmons and Judd Apatow's Funny People, Fitzgerald's fingerprints are infused in so many American dream stories that it's easy to forget that a person just created him, whole cloth, before the 20s had even found themselves. In Brady Corbet's The Brutalist, we find a remixing of the Gatsby story and a blurring of the lines between the fact and fictions of Fitzgerald's own life. Of course, it's likely that Corbet had no intentions of paralleling Fitzgerald at all or The Great Gatsby, but the story of Gatsby is so inextricably woven into the tapestry of America's mythology that to tell a story about the American dream is to tell the story of Gatsby over and over again, in the hopes that one day it'll go differently. I don't envision The Brutalist as any kind of conscious adaptation of Fitzgerald's work, but instead a remix of the ideas inherent within it. For the last century, The Great Gatsby's insistence that winning the American dream requires some kind of soul sacrifice persists in works spanning all media. It's not that Fitzgerald invented the hollow capitalist who makes a Faustian bargain in exchange for his humanity. It's just that The Great Gatsby's timing and execution cut through culture like a hot knife through butter. When we watch narratives of this focus, it's hard not to think back to that monument of American excess. I don't see Gatsby in a single character, nor do I find Nick or Daisy or Tom anywhere in The Brutalist. But instead, I see a rich combination and cocktail of these various American archetypes throughout the cast of characters. Since 100 years have passed since the publishing of The Great Gatsby, we've been through the modernists, we've been through the postmodernists. Part of the success of The Great Gatsby is owed to what I would call the grandiose understatement of Fitzgerald's work. And the same qualities of grandiose understatement are found in The Brutalist. So when I say grandiose understatement, what do I mean? In Chapter 3 of The Great Gatsby, over 50 pages deep into the book ostensibly about him, we finally actually meet the title character. Unlike the Baz Luhrmann adaptation, which is just full grandiose, Fitzgerald himself subverts expectation by introducing Gatsby as a fairly nondescript guy just sitting at a table. The expectation of the audience is that he would be the life of the party, the biggest personality in the room, but instead he's just kind of an introverted loner. The party itself, as presented by Fitzgerald in Chapter 3, is also a bit of a letdown after pages and pages of buildup. Sure, it's big and loud, but Nick isn't that interested, and neither is Gatsby. It's a giant, bombastic party played in a minor key. Similarly, The Brutalist begins with a VistaVision title card and presents each scene with the visual language of a great David Lean-esque epic, but the script is crowded by small conversations in dark rooms. When the budget for The Brutalist was announced as being so low, under $10 million, people reacted with astonishment about how Corbet was able to achieve such an epic film for so little. But it's written all over the screen. Sure, The Brutalist is quite lengthy and it has big ideas in these large landscapes, but the events of the film are actually quite claustrophobic. There are relatively few sets and fewer characters, and much of the film is written like an intimate chamber drama. The Great Gatsby, too, seems to convey one thing while functioning as something else. For the uninitiated, The Great Gatsby is a maximalist novel about American culture, containing within it the debauchery and the exhilaration of a decade of excess. But in reality, it's mostly the story of a handful of people having conversations in rooms. Fitzgerald's ornate language almost tricks the audience into believing in a largeness that just isn't there. And The Brutalist is the same way, with its sweeping, if infrequent, epic shots of landscapes and huge VistaVision canvas. Corbet more implies largeness instead of showing it plainly. The grandiose understatement even extends to Gatsby himself. Our vision of him almost never matches the reality we are given. That is the great trick of Fitzgerald's writing. The beauty and the poetry of his prose masks the bland neutrality of his identity. The contradiction of Fitzgerald's prose with the story similarly matched the self-conscious filmmaking compared to the events themselves of The Brutalist. And it makes me wonder, isn't this how America kind of views itself? Grand ideas, huge, sweeping promises of wealth and power and love and honor, but just beneath the surface, a suspicion of hollowness. A desperate need for purpose and validation hovers in the air of every great work about the American dream. A constant duality, suggesting both a fantastic dream and the realism of never quite reaching it. In addition to these formal similarities between The Brutalist and The Great Gatsby, the characters themselves mirror each other in interesting ways. We see flashes of Gatsby in both Toth and Van Buren. Nick is present as well in the guest house out back, being welcomed into this world of the rich but never fully accepted by it. Tom Buchanan is just as present in all of the Van Burens, split between Harrison and his son. One-to-one comparisons mean little here, but the continuity of personalities all lend themselves to a story forever told, an American mythology. There must always be an outsider, a dream of upward mobility, a symbol of old money, and an explosive confrontation regarding the nature of power. Laszlo Toth carries with him the crisis of identity we so tie to Gatsby. He doesn't change his name to create a new life, but that moment of crossing into America is a baptism of sorts. The new road ahead of him at Morris & Sons, where there is nobody named Morris nor any sons, represents the deconstruction of the self required for assimilation. As Toth himself doesn't change his name, and as his accent, according to Harrison Van Buren, years after Toth's arrival remains unchanged, then the requisite new identity has less to do with outward appearance than it does the vision of the self. It's after the intermission that Toth reveals to Elizabeth that no amount of assimilation or taste or wealth or prestige will ever embed them fully into the lives of Americans. The stench of otherness will surround them, no matter who they become. Gatsby, too, struggles to assimilate neatly into the world of the New York elite, with that same uncanny otherness. His house is expensive and lavish, but it is deemed tasteless and tacky. Everything about Gatsby is too curated, too carefully controlled, too slick to be considered authentic. The adaptations have trained us to believe that Gatsby is a handsome man, but in the novel, he's meant to be plain, almost forgettable. He's introduced not as the beautiful, charismatic owner of $1 million mansion, but as a random partygoer at a table with Nick Carraway 3 chapters into the book about him. This too is true for Harrison Van Buren, the shipping baron of New England. Like Gatsby, Van Buren is new money, eager to please the oligarchs who surround him and always vainly chasing the prestige and taste his money can buy. But he has no taste of his own. Hating the modern library Toth builds for him, and it's only in the acceptance of Toth's work by design magazines that allow Van Buren to understand the artist he has discovered. Like Gatsby, Van Buren has no sense of self. He lives to please his mother, to please the wealthy men he surrounds himself with, to leave the legacy of goodwill and community behind without ever really investing any interest or time in either. It's these domestic spaces that fragments of Gatsby live in The Brutalist. Around dinner tables and behind closed doors, men who lack confidence or courage to be their true selves for fear of losing everything they've built. Through Van Buren, Toth is able to manifest the American dream he so desperately wanted, but to see its completion is to lose his soul in the process. Toth forgoes his paycheck, loses the love and trust of his family, and sacrifices his warmth and good nature at the mantle of greatness. The aspects of Gatsby we see in Toth is his willingness to obliterate himself in pursuit of something more. Van Buren has achieved his dream before the start of the film, and is in some ways what we would find if Gatsby survived his story. Van Buren is a phantom who has been created and destroyed by the very ego that saved him from his obscurity. It's charisma and strong will and his sense for people that allow him to reach the heights of his success, and he has also lost the parts of him that make him human. In the final act of The Brutalist, Van Buren's insistence to own everything, to control everything, ends up destroying him. In The Great Gatsby, Jay's comeuppance arrives as death in a swimming pool at the hands of somebody who never knew Gatsby's true crimes, wrongfully accused and killed for another man's sins. In this way, Gatsby dies as both innocent and guilty, but he had to die all the same for what he represented. No man can banish so much of his own soul without dying in the process. Van Buren, then, is the flip side of that path. His self-possession and destructive trail of human collateral ends at the revelation of his true face. But he's not killed. He's not forced to face retribution. He just vanishes. In a surreal twist near the end of The Brutalist, Van Buren's climactic scene in which his sins are brought to the surface also jettison him completely from the film. He just never appears again. Erzsébet's narrative trajectory mirrors that of Zelda herself, enclosed and infirm and kept from the public for fear of her honesty. Her wealth of vulnerability and her observant nature make her a core of chaos in the inauthentic spaces Van Buren and Toth maintain. The ease of her honesty wields tremendous power over the men in her life, and as the film continues, her hold over Toth loses sway to the promises of Van Buren. In the climactic showdown, Toth isn't even there. It's just Erzsébet who storms a business dinner at the Van Buren mansion. It's Erzsébet who makes her damning accusation, and it's Erzsébet who is dragged from the mansion by Van Buren's son, screaming. In Fitzgerald's life, it was Zelda who lived with freedom and honesty. It was Zelda who pushed him and asked for nothing but honesty in his work. And like Toth and The Brutalist, that honesty and challenge was violently rejected. Zelda was also widely regarded by the lost generation as unpredictable, difficult to maintain a relationship with, emotionally erratic. Over the course of a few years, Zelda would go from being the social center of American expats in Paris to a patient moving in and out of mental hospitals. Years of shock treatment and ill health led to her death 8 years after her husband's. In The Brutalist, Erzsébet's fate remains a mystery, but each of her scenes place her firmly into a state of otherness through her disability. Laszlo is marginalized by his accent and his artistic ambitions, but Erzsébet's otherness stems from her physical limitations. Despite her delayed arrival into both the country and the film itself, Erzsébet is immediately more communicative than her husband, expertly talking circles around the other characters and maintaining an honest and accurate perspective on Laszlo's relationship with Van Buren. Zelda similarly suffered for circumstances outside of her control, fought to find love and partnership, and was also jettisoned from her own life. The Brutalist is about the empty promise of the American dream, a story we've heard dozens and dozens of times and in dozens of ways. It transforms and transmutes common tropes from this mythology, adds its own textures, and remixes themes and characters from the American dream text of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. The duality of the characters in The Brutalist and The Great Gatsby reflect America's murky promise of wealth and fame, and the soul sacrifices we may have to make to achieve it. Everything from the ostentatious and self-conscious artistry to the subtle hints of fragmented identities. The Brutalist carries on the tradition of grandiose understatement in art portraying the American dream. Thank you for watching.